started. Thank you for joining, and if you can't hear me on Zoom, please let me know. We'll try to get that working. I'm gonna let Susan do the introductions.
All right. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaret Woodbridge. Came down from Asheville, and so she said she wanted some normalcy. So welcome to Clemson. I'm not sure it's a normal place, but hopefully it's getting back into some science.
The toilet's flushed in the bathroom, so
Right.
we're good.
So, Margaret did her bachelor's degree at Appalachian State, so she is a native of North Carolina, and then did her master's at University of Minnesota and her PhD at SUNY Syracuse. She's been with Forest Service since 2021.
2020 barely.
2020. And she was on a variety of programs, the ORISE Fellow and the RAP program. So students, you might want to ask her about that because it's a great way to get into the Forest Service. So we were very fortunate to hire her on permanently this year. And she's been working on a variety of projects, most recently doing a lot of work on old growth forests. So with that, I will turn it over to Margaret. Thank you for coming down.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I will mention, this is going to be less polished than I would normally like it to be, and excuse any typos because we have not had power and didn't have internet until last night. This was not the normal prepare for a presentation process that I would normally go through. So I figure I've still got some interesting things to say, and we can have some really cool discussions about old growth and Southern Apps. Also, I want to mention Susan has been super supportive while everything has been insane. I live in Black Mountain, so yes, it's all flooded and everything's a bit of a disaster. So if you can, find a boss that's really great. And I'm not just sucking up because Susan will soon not be my boss, but I just want to mention, I know many of you work with her, that she's fantastic. And the Forest Service has been really good about rolling with a really interesting situation. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. It does feel normal. This is my first real work day this week, and it feels really nice to kind of be here and talk about science instead of trying to get, the power on and your town cleaned up. So a bunch of people have contributed to the variety of work you're going to see here, many of them not named, but just know there's a bunch of folks who have worked on this. Some folks from my dissertation work when I was at SUNY USF. So Martin Dubček, Jason, who's also here now, but was at Syracuse at the time. I worked with him some on this project. So some of these names may be familiar to you. So I'm just going to roughly go through and talk about some of the differences that we see between mature forest and old growth in the Southern Appalachians, and also where on the landscape we might potentially see some of these differences. Now, underlying all of this is the really complex question of how you go about defining even mature or old growth forests. And I'm part of the old growth working group right now, working on some of those questions. And I promise you, we have had so many discussions, intricate conversations, and there's no easy answer there. So I'm happy to talk in detail more about that, but in general, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm thinking of old growth forests that have not experienced intensive land use in terms of clearing, agriculture, even really more diffuse disturbances like selective logging. So we're kind of talking about old growth in that context. And in many of the comparisons here, you're going to see mature forests, the forests that probably experienced some of those disturbances, maybe late 1800s, early 1900s, but have since not had that sort of intensive land use. And that's not to say that there hasn't been extensive, very intensity indigenous use of these lands. And so it's important to think about this in the context of that history. And when I'm mentioning, not that intensive anthropogenic disturbance, I'm really talking about that kind of clear cutting disturbance. So just to give you some context here, these are actually pictures from 1930s-ish from Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So this gives you a comparison of what some of the forests kind of experienced in terms of that intensive land use compared to some of those areas that didn't necessarily experience that disturbance. And I like this comparison Because superficially, many of these forests don't necessarily look that different today. If you're just kind of walking through and not thinking about that, many of these forests that experience this, like that early 1900s, look, big trees, canopy cover. It doesn't necessarily look superficially like these forests are drastically different. And in some cases, they may not be, but in others, quite possibly. So we talked a little bit about this, underlying all of these forested areas, you have some particular disturbances that are kind of occurring throughout. So just keep in mind chestnut blight. It occurred in areas across those kind of land use histories, but also in patterns along that sort of landscape. So you could think of these background disturbances, say something like chestnut blight that would hit chestnut trees on those mid slopes, at least in the Southern Appalachians. So you'd see kind of that oak hickory forest that was probably chestnut, oak and hickory. And those types of forests would experience that disturbance. And I'm mentioning this just to say you've got these different patterns, both in terms of land use history and this more natural disturbance. We'll just use that word in a simplified way here. But that more natural disturbance occurred also on these kind of landscape gradients. And you've got some more pictures just to sort of drive home the differences between some of these histories. So really what we're seeing here is there was this drastic change in the disturbance regime, right? Where previously there was probably a lot less intensive canopy removal overall, although given the recent hurricane, we sure did get quite a bit of canopy removal recently, even if that was probably on the, several 100-year cycle. But we see again, different changes in that disturbance regime. And so we got this pulse essentially really early 1800s, early 1900s, that pulse of disturbance. And it wasn't necessarily just large-scale exploitative clear cutting. It was also increased grazing, increased slash fires across the landscape, and likely pretty intense fires in areas that maybe didn't experience it previously because of that unique disturbance. So that overstory taken out, you get a lot of slash, you get a couple dry years, and then you have pretty extensive fires occurring, even in maybe those really wetter, more cove conditions than you would expect. And this is, Susan will have seen this slide. This is one of Tara's amazing slides, just representing that, right? That you have this pulse of these interacting disturbances that really changed our forests. And in many cases, this variety of disturbances are kind of the originating event for many of our mature forests that we see today. And you see that essentially when you look at our estimates of stand age across the landscape, right? We really have this kind of pulse of forests that are, maybe a little younger than 100, but around 100 years old. And that's related directly to that pulse of disturbance that occurred with that European settlement. No reason to look in detail at this unless you want to go back and read the environmental impact statement, which is complicated. But what this graph essentially is representing is what we might expect kind of forest age and forest type distributions to look like given a natural disturbance regime. So in conditions that we would expect prior to that sort of big pulse of interacting disturbances. And long story short, we see very different both forest types and forest age distributions than we might expect. We have a bunch, if we go actually back, we have a bunch of these middle-aged forests across the landscape, but really we're missing a ton of that older forest, but we're also missing some young. And this is another example of that. If we look at by ecozone, current forests, kind of so the blue, and we're looking by forest type. And then estimates for the natural range of variation is the yellow. So if you compare the blue to yellow, you're comparing what we see now versus what we would potentially expect in the yellow if that natural range of variation in terms of that disturbance was what was maintaining our forests. So those ice storms, those landslides, occasionally those hurricanes, gap phase dynamics of individual trees dying and creating those small scale gaps of maybe one tree or several trees on the landscape. So there have been some pretty valiant and impressive attempts to evaluate how much old growth we actually have on the landscape, those old forests that maybe didn't experience that disturbance. So many authors recently were tasked with creating a map of old growth, which is an almost impossible task. And they created, based on, in particular, I think this is national forest lands or nationally owned lands, estimates of both mature and old growth characteristics, and based on FIA data. Raise your hand if you're familiar with FIA data. Okay, most but not everybody. Just short and sweet, FIA is a Forest Service inventory that's across the whole country, but it's at a large scale. So you have plots that are pretty far apart from each other, but it covers the entire country and gives you broad scale estimates, essentially, of what our forests look like. And they're resampled, I think around here, of like 5 to 7 years generally, is kind of the turnaround time for resampling of those forests. So you can get big looks at what's going on, kind of the broader scale. So this is based on that. It's an amazingly giant effort, incredible sampling scheme. But you can see that we're really lacking a lot of old growth on the landscape. And so old growth in these cases is the bluer, or like really deep bluish purple. And we really don't see much of that. We've got quite a bit more mature. What we're seeing, just kind of summarize, is that we had that big pulse of disturbance. The vast majority of our forest experienced that kind of interacting suite of disturbances. And there's some few small parts that did not. It may represent forests that look pretty different. So one of the questions that we're really looking at here is, are there actually really meaningful differences between these mature forests and old growth, if we're categorizing this way? And what does that actually mean? Are these forests now similar because they've hit 100 years old? And do they look similar for, say, things like wildlife or potentially downwoody debris that might be important, or diversity? And are these potential differences the same no matter where you go? So are they the same down in the cove in a rich cove forest? Are they the same if you go up to high elevation spruce fir forests? Are they the same if you go up on a ridge, a dry pine dominated site? Or are there important differences? Because one of the things we've seen recently with the attempt to try to do a better job defining old growth is part of the struggle is that depending on what forest type you're in, these forests look totally different in old growth condition. You might have tiny trees that are really old on a ridge, might be gnarled and short. You might have giant trees in that cove and giant downwoody debris. So you've got some pretty interesting differences by forest. But there's some general trends we can see, and I'm actually going to skip this. But overall, we see that there's a lot of times increasing variation and differentiation as we go through time. So if we're roughly kind of thinking, okay, stand age, if we're thinking just structurally of old growth, you would move from younger forest more towards old growth. And here we have this similar trend. You see increasing variation as you go through time in terms of species composition. And you increase complexity. So you can kind of think of like when we were talking at NAFI about stem exclusion phase, where you have trees where there's very little variation in tree size. Everybody looks the same, everybody's pretty young, and there's intense competition. And then through time, you see that increase in variation. So you might have a couple big trees and a few smaller trees. So some of the differences that we start to see as you increase in age is that increase in variation. And that increases through time. And so sometimes when people look at old growth, they look at something like the coefficient of variation, which is a way of evaluating how variable stands are. And there's, a couple other differences. So anyway, this is essentially saying we increase some complexity, or we start to see that. And throughout, I've included some cool, I think, old historical photographs. These are all in the public domain. I can give you the website if you're interested, but when you're giving presentations, it's really cool to be able to pick out these old photographs, or really interesting photographs. And they're all, no copyright, you can use them. Usually they were taken by federal employees. So you've got some access to see kind of snapshots into what forests used to look like. So one of those characteristics that I was just mentioning is kind of that diversity of tree sizes, in addition to that diversity of tree ages. So for example, if we're looking at kind of variation in, say, like an old growth stand a maturing or mature stand, and a parched and cut stand, we see one of the biggest noticeable differences is oftentimes those large trees. And it's not usually the like larger group of large trees, but it's usually a few very big individuals are missing in general. And if you compare those three, that's kind of one of the big drivers there. Now, that being said, this is most likely to be seen in those forests that actually can grow big trees. So when we think of things like site index or those richer sites, this is more pronounced in those areas where you have, the potential for big trees to grow. And we see this kind of here as well. So here's another example. Let me make sure I've got, this here. And when you look through that, this can happen to some extent in those drier sites. It's less pronounced when we look here in the big areas, but you still see, you'll get maybe like one tree. It's much bigger, but not always, right? Not in every stand. And there's not one quick and easy answer for this comparison. But again, you can also see too, that you would expect that variation in those few old trees. But one point I want to make, in addition when we're thinking about variation in different sites, is that you don't have this perfect, nice DBH to age ratio. So Dawn, who was a part of this and sadly passed away in January, always used to say, you can't assume that all big trees are old and all old trees are big. I think he said that on every weekly call that we had in Old Growth working with. But this is a good example of that I think is important to remember, is that you don't have that perfect relationship. And I've been into some amazing mature stands that were definitely cut with some huge tulip poplar, beautiful trees, but they're not that old. But then you go to Joyce Kilmer, right? And just giant tulip poplar. So it's not as easy as just big trees, unfortunately. That would be really easy. And just a way to sort of drive that home is when you look at age classes. So here we're seeing 4 examples of old growth stands. We're seeing you've got in all 4 stands, trees that are old, right? So we've got some representation on the far right-hand side. But if we compare diameter class, we don't necessarily see in all stands that you've got those big trees, right? But in this stand, you still have trees that are old. They're just not as big. And that's within a particular forest type. So that again tells you there's not some quick, easy, oh, it's a big tree, it's an old stand. Or I guess if there's an absence of large trees, then it's not an old stand. There also, excuse me, has a tendency to be greater number of snags, so the standing dead wood. And in particular, you can kind of look at some decay class patterns as well. So if we compare again, mature to old growth forests, and decay class being, that increasing level of decay, we see that in old growth 1, in many cases, there's a lot more coarse woody debris, but also in those more decayed classes, you oftentimes see that being the one area where you get bigger differences when you compare, say, mature versus old growth. So you get more dead stuff, but in particular, that dead stuff is highly decayed and also large diameter dead trees. So you might, when you think of younger stands, there's plenty of dead wood. But that really, really big log that's really well decayed, that's more likely to be in those older stands. And again, this kind of gives an example of there is a little variation by forest type. So if we look at, say, standing snags here in this kind of dry mesic in one forest type group, right? We can see that range, if we look at the range and the mean, can vary quite a bit. So again, this is another example of why it's really, really hard when we're trying to quantify what does an old growth stand look like. It looks very different depending on what site you're on. So, and again, it's not just downwoody debris, it's also snags. You'll see quite a bit of that variation. And again, it's the highly decayed is oftentimes the biggest difference you see. So if we look here, this is from the Smokies. You have primary forest, so what we're referring to is old growth here on the far left-hand side, and an increasing sort of intensity disturbance as you move left to right. So concentrated settlement. And in this case, these are all disturbances that happened late early 1900s. And then the park was acquired in the 1930s. So you had all of this stopping in terms of this disturbance in, say, 1930. And then this is a comparison of the forest that we have now. So this is a longer term response, right? And so we still see, there's quite a bit more of that highly decayed downed dead wood and what we're calling old growth forest compared to others. But you do still see, some of this here in these forests in particular that experience that kind of clear cutting response. Maybe a little bit less so in, say, like that concentrated settlement, which would have represented homesteads, areas that were farmed, plowed. Those forests look a little bit different. And this is just, I thought, a really nice picture of giant downed wood. You don't see that very much. So I may have accidentally added this slide twice, so we're just going to skip through that really fast. Microtopography. Related to also that land use history in terms of plowing and areas that experience agriculture can change the topography. And when I say topography, I mean not a mountain, but that microtopography. So tip up mound when a tree falls down might produce that kind of root ball. That creates scenarios where you might have regeneration that looks a little different, that's safe from deer browse because it's high up. And I'm an understory person, so I am anti-deer, pro areas that are safe from deer browse. Herbaceous plants are, I think, my first passion. But you just can start to see some differences also in soil condition. So it's important to think about some of those smaller scale differences on the understory between these forests too. Now, that being said, in some areas, trees fall, even in areas that are not old growth forests. So you are going to see some of that microtopography in those areas. It may just be less pronounced, but you might have an area that experienced a tornado or a hurricane, and where you do still see that difference in microtopography. In comparison to that, you also may see some variation in things structurally. So you might have a forest that is maintained by, say, canopy gaps, and the turnover is really slow year to year. And you might see areas where you don't necessarily have as much variation in not just kind of the horizontal structure on the ground, so say microtopography, but also that vertical structure as you go from low to high, which is, kind of a rough proxy for tree size. If you have smaller and larger trees, then you've got probably that stratified canopy across the forest. So you can start to also think about if you have presence of those gaps, if you have that variation, areas where you might have smaller trees and then larger trees outside of those, what might have been previously gaps. And that kind of gets back to that question of if you have variation in tree size, so the big trees and the small trees, so that kind of increase in variation, that results in things like increase in kind of that stratification and variation as you go from low to high, if that makes sense. Okay, so we talked about some of the general things that we see. I will also say that much of this has not been directly tested. So these are difficult questions to really get at scientifically and in terms of studies, in large part because we have so little old growth. And in the spots that we do have it, it can be really tough to find forests that are similar enough that you can make a direct comparison without necessarily saying, okay, the differences here are due to site index or some difference in slope or aspect or elevation. And so it can be really, really hard to truly understand what the differences are between old growth and these mature forests. But some of the work I've done with some folks at Syracuse and ESF and the Forest Service was to make some comparison in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is one of the few spots you have good data on old growth because you've got land use records from who owned the land prior to when it was bought in the 1930s. you've got pretty good information on areas that were logged, and there's some pretty cool historical photographs that help you understand that. But what I'm really meaning to say is we have a pretty good idea of where on the landscape in the Smokies wasn't logged or didn't experience that disturbance and where it did. So you can kind of make that comparison, and you also have big enough chunks of old growth that you can compare landscape conditions. So you can compare high elevation to low elevation because you have high and low elevation old growth and high and low elevation areas that experience that disturbance. You've also got those coves, those ridges. You've got kind of this long environmental gradient of old growth to make those comparisons instead of trying to find one small stand of old growth and find the perfect other stand to compare it to, which is kind of a struggle. So, and long story short, what I'm going to talk about on that last graph, there was a bunch of studies. The results I'm going to talk about now are from a accumulation of many studies, a bunch of vegetation work that was done, and many hundreds of plots to kind of get where we are now. In large part because they're needed to make these kind of broader, more landscape scale conclusions. So if you look at this, raise your hand if you've seen this, essentially this graph before. Oh, okay, 5, maybe 7 people. This is a pretty famous graph done by Whitaker in the Smokies that looks at describing the different forest types that you see in the Southern Appalachians generally. And you've got down here on your x-axis wetter conditions, so kind of that cove area to those drier ridges and peaks. And then you've got elevation and or temperature is essentially what's represented by that elevational gradient, a little bit of rainfall and other variables, but essentially an elevation / temperature gradient on that y-axis. And then you've got the different forest types that you generally see here. And when he created this graph, he was looking at an area that had not necessarily experienced that clear cutting. And so you're getting a rough estimate of, again, those forest types without necessarily that disturbance. And while he was looking at this, chestnut trees were dying, I think, but still kind of present. So you could get a sense of the importance of chestnut on the landscape. So just kind of something interesting to look at. So I essentially compared that graph in the absence of that clear cutting disturbance and then looked at that landscape where those areas had experienced that disturbance to see what was different. Does that make sense? The comparison? Okay. I also have some pretty Joyce Kilmer photos that I took recently that I threw in. So everybody can see cool, pretty old growth and spring ephemerals, a very important herbaceous layer. It also was sleeting. So I added in a little bit just to sort of, as we're looking at results, give you some context. I added some photos that I took doing field work to give you kind of a sense of what is some of these forests roughly look like. So these are just pretty photos that you're like, hey, I don't really know what these forests might look like. This is kind of an example for you on the park. And I tried to add some of the kind of heath bald areas there to give you kind of some more examples. And kind of the beach gap forest here, which is those really interesting forests that are dominated by really small diameter beech that are probably pretty old. And it looks very different from the beech forest that we think of. Usually a pretty herbaceous dominated understory, lots of very little beech. But another example of might be an old growth forest, but might not have a bunch of big trees. You'll occasionally see like a big yellow buckeye in there, medium-sized yellow buckeye in there, but in general, most of the trees are pretty small. So when I took all these plots, and the plots were, structured across the landscape, kind of pretty well all across this graph. There isn't a ton of old growth forest down here, just because people really like to live in low elevation areas. And so it's hard to find areas that weren't settled or logged in the low elevations. So most of these conclusions are kind of coming from that area here. But other than that, it was generally pretty well distributed across this landscape. So we compared first just general richness, number of species, and we looked at the understory. And in general, we found that ground layer richness in areas that had been logged in the past is lower, but mostly in this area that's lower elevation and in those wetter conditions. which is kind of where we would think of that rich cove forest, that quintessential beautiful forest with that really rich understory. That seems to be the area that's hit the hardest following that disturbance, where you don't necessarily see that either recovery or resilience of the understory. Oh, here's some pretty pictures of that, just to make you appreciate the understory a little bit more and show off my fancy photos. And some more, okay, here we go. We also looked at shrub richness and tree richness as well. And we did see that there was a slight decrease in shrub richness in areas that had been clear cut. So in that mature forest, because again, this comparison is occurring, 100, 150 years later after that previous disturbance. So we see a smaller decrease. I think it was roughly like 1.5 species per plot. And some of the plot sizes did vary, but for richness values, we were looking at like 200 square meters. So we did see a decrease in shrub richness. Oh, and let me go back. I also compared tree richness. We didn't see differences in tree richness. When you looked at richness between those old growth and mature forests, we didn't really find necessarily that difference in the number of species when you looked at the tree layer. We also made some comparisons about what might be driving some of that difference that we were seeing, in particular in the understory. So, and this was excruciating. I went through and tried to find the dispersal mechanism for the hundreds of species that were in all of these plots. It's really tough to do. But there has been some great work done and some great databases there. But looking at dispersal strategy. So ant dispersal, or maybe you disperse your seeds through gravity, which means they just fall on the ground and wherever that leaves them is where they are. Or so wind and animal dispersal are usually much more effective at getting your seeds further away, right? So we wanted to see maybe, is the way in which you move yourself around or move your seeds around impacting a potential plant's ability to recover following that disturbance? And we did see that across the landscape, and this is understory species. We saw that locally dispersed species, so ones that don't get their seeds very far. So generally this is gravity dispersal, this is ant dispersal, things like that. There were fewer of those species across the landscape following that, or in mature forests compared to old growth, if that makes sense. And it was kind of interesting that we didn't necessarily see a difference in richness throughout, but we did see these particular species being less common. And so just some examples of some pretty ant dispersed species in the spring. And one potential thought about some of what might be happening here is there might be a transition kind of away from gap phase dynamics. And so we also looked at some of the traits of trees. So we were just looking at some of those dispersal traits of the understory. Also looked at traits of the overstory, or canopy trees in general. We looked at things like growth rate and shade tolerance and drought tolerance. And I'm showing the growth rate and the shade tolerance characteristics together because they're highly correlated. And so it's really tough to kind of say this response is due to growth rate when it could very well be due to shade tolerance or a little bit of both. So we're just kind of presenting them together. I'm showing some of the differences in growth rate and shade tolerance in mature forest, so the red or pink lines, and in old growth, so kind of the blue lines. And we looked at these differences, and these are the community weighted means. There are some slight issues with using that statistical approach. I'm happy to have a long discussion about that, but we're not going to do that right now. Ask me about it later. So we looked at kind of the mean condition of a plot versus some of these environmental gradients that we would see. So topographic condition, maybe in this case, topographic wetness index, which is essentially saying a ridge to more of that cove sheds water, is drier, accumulates water, is wetter, versus radiation. So areas that receive a lot of sunlight, so top of a ridge, that south facing slope, or areas that necessarily don't, so lower radiation. There's more either coves or sheltered areas, more north-facing slopes. And what we found is that in mature forests specifically, you had trees with greater growth rates and lower shade tolerance than those old growth forests, but it wasn't necessarily that case across the landscape and everywhere, right? It was mainly in these areas, kind of in sheltered areas and in wetter areas. And that kind of makes sense, right? That you will see this larger difference, and you would expect in mature forests, considering that large scale canopy disturbance, to see trees that did really well, that grow fast and are not necessarily very shade tolerant. They do well in those conditions. So tulip poplar is the quintessential example, right? Also, red maple is just everywhere in all of these forests. So to kind of summarize, what we're saying is, in tree species, we've got this increased growth rate and decreased shade tolerance. I couldn't really ask these questions about the shrub layer or the understory because good data on this doesn't really exist for the hundreds of understory species. And I'm not exaggerating, it's hundreds of species in the understory there. Just not enough data, functional trait data to be able to ask these questions. So we're seeing kind of that difference, and it's wasn't just observed by me, essentially. So this is work by Julie Tuttle, awesome researcher. And she also compared both from some plot data that was done in the 1930s and more recent plot data in the Smokies, traits of tree species in both areas that were undisturbed, so that's kind of the old growth that we're talking about here, versus some of these other disturbance types, so the corporate logging, which was that large scale clear cutting, that settlement. And the biggest difference, when we compare both through time and between these different disturbance histories, is that you don't really have this strong shade tolerant, I'm pretty sure that's what, shade tolerant and late successional species are a much greater proportion of that basal area in those old growth forests. Now you see them present in these other areas, but that's just a really significant difference that makes these forests stand out in comparison to these other forest types. Also, one thing I noticed when we looked at forest types, and I am not keeping track of time, so if I get close, if someone can just flag me down. We looked at kind of that variation in trait condition across the landscape. Does that make sense? So we've got here kind of that condition on the landscape. So areas that are really sheltered, not a lot of sun, areas that get a lot of sun. And then we're looking at how in, say, mature, so the pink versus the old growth, the blue, do you see differences in traits as you move, say, like around the mountain, or you move from that sheltered to that higher slope? And what we're kind of seeing is you don't see much variation if you're in the mature forest in those conditions of the trees. You see trees that kind of, are similarly shade tolerant as you go around. Versus you see differences, greater differences across that kind of environmental condition in old growth. The blue lines are more slanted as opposed to flatter, suggesting there's greater differences as you move across the landscape in old growth forest. Does that make sense? Okay, a lot more nods than last time. Now, this is a mean condition as well. So this is looking at a plot, looking at a stand, and looking at the average condition. So you're seeing greater differences in the average condition. That is not the same thing as looking at how variable those conditions are. If you're standing there, do you have a bunch of trees with very different characteristics? And we did find that in mature forest, we often saw greater variation at the plot level. So at the stand, you'd see there, the average condition might be similar, but you might have more differences in individuals there within one stand, if that makes sense. So there's some interesting potential things going on here in terms of how forests look overall following this disturbance. But one of the main takeaways is you see this kind of homogenization effect. So increasing similarity in your forests on average as you go across the landscape in that old growth forest, if that makes sense. Forests look more similar. And we also see, in addition to kind of that larger similarity trend, one of the strongest trends that we found in the overstory with tree species when we compared the two, mature and old growth, was related to tree species that resprout. So other folks have found this in terms of comparing pre-European settlement tree conditions. Essentially what this is saying is tree species that resprout are more common in mature forests. And this makes sense, right? Tree species that resprout are excellent at competing following clear cutting or canopy disturbance. You're gonna win if you're resprouting in almost all cases. And that kind of legacy effect is still present if we look at overall that proportional cover. So just to put it in visual. And that again is across the landscape. So we've kind of looked at species-specific responses or those community responses. We can also look at overall the larger landscape patterns, independent of some of that specific environmental gradient aspect. And there have been other studies, that have found that there's a simplification of the landscape when you have had that past disturbance. So you see less variation. And this is just kind of visualization of that when you look at an old growth landscape versus the second growth landscape in this case. And we found something somewhat similar where we looked at all of the plots. We looked at the whole Smokies essentially and used multivariate dispersion. Again, happy to talk about the stats, but I love talking about the stats, but I won't do it now. So we looked at the compositions, the makeup of all of these stands, went to a bunch of these plots. What do all of these look like in terms of composition? And we compared, so the mature, in this case, the black dots, and old growth, the red. The main takeaway here is look at those bubbles, the summaries. So these are these covariance ellipses. You've essentially got this black circle encompassed within the red. The red is broader and more spread out, which means you have more variation across all of those stands. So you've got greater variation across the landscape. And this is controlling for, those landscape conditions that can create a lot of variation, because you don't want to just have, old growth plots that are in a bunch of different environmental conditions that make them more variable. So this is controlling for those aspects to the best of my ability in that landscape. So essentially what we see is that homogenization effect again, right? So you have increasing similarity in those mature forests compared to that old growth. If I just kind of look all across the mountains. And as is always nice, it was significant. You can also, how long do I have? When do I end?
About 12.
12?
Because how many minutes for questions? I think 15.
Okay, I'm gonna go fast. I'm gonna assume it's 12 and go fast. So,
You can go, the class period ends at 12:15, so.
Yeah.
okay, but questions and discussion, so. Quickly, I broke up the landscape into these different categories to also look at composition. In large part, I did this because if you have a plot here and a plot here, if they share 0 species, you get a similarity value of, I don't really know what that means. If you share no species, if any of you have done the compositional work, you know how much of a pain it is if you have 2 plots and they share no species. So broke things up to avoid that. And found, yeah, I actually do want to go forward. And we did find significant differences between the mature and old growth, but it did vary depending on where you were on the landscape, right? So we found that mature forests were significantly different in terms of their makeup in those high elevation forests. And it's pretty well known, those spruce fir forests have kind of been hit really hard. The balsam woolly adelgid, acid rain, and then there's been really slow recovery in a lot of these spruce fir forests following logging. That intense fire and slash fire was just a really odd thing that didn't normally happen in those forests. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing that significant difference in those high elevation forests. We see, again, a significant difference in those kind of classic cove forests, those wetter forest conditions, but we don't see as much of a compositional difference in these ridges and peaks, these drier conditions. And there potentially could be a couple reasons for that. Oh, that's mentioning, those differences. I'm going to skip forward to this. So here's my nice dry or xeric ridge. And this is again where we didn't necessarily find as many richness differences or compositional differences between old growth and mature forests. And it may be that there's different changes in disturbance history that are more important, like fire suppression. And fire suppression was happening everywhere. It was happening in the old growth forest, it was happening in mature forests. And that may be a stronger driver of composition here than, say, that past logging. It may also be that these drier ridges were more adapted to those fire conditions. And so when you did have that clear cutting and then that slash fire, it wasn't as big of a difference of that disturbance than you would necessarily see in those drier ridges. They experienced fire, more likely to be struck by lightning, more likely to be drier, and then have conditions where you would see fire. And so I don't have, good data for this. This is just kind of speculation based on trend in the data and what we potentially know about these forests. So this is kind of an interesting takeaway and one thing to think about. Okay, maybe old growth forests that are on those drier ridges, that fire suppression is a bigger problem, or it makes a bigger difference there. Compared to, say, our old growth and co-forests where that disturbance of removing the entire canopy looks very different than, say, those gap phase dynamics where a single tree fall might have been what normally occurred and kind of kept those forests up. And that total canopy removal just looks so different from that small spot of sunlight. And I think it's just some more pretty pictures and seeing the differences, but I think it's 12:01. So I'm going to quickly stop and ask for questions. And I'm happy to just chat about any of it. So thanks, everybody.
So you talked earlier about differences in microtopology between mature and old growth. Have you looked into the effects of that at all, or do you know anybody who has not just flattening because of agriculture, but when you do intensive logging, there's a lot of soil compaction as well? I don't know if is that still visible?
So I think that's a great question. And I'm sure there has been some work done in particular, maybe not necessarily on did experience that, but they did pre and post harvest of those soil compaction trends. I bet a lot of this is you have to sort of glean that, okay, we saw a response to soil compaction or a decrease in that more homogenization of that microtopography pre and post. And so we're assuming that because that hasn't necessarily happened in those old growth forests. I do know, and so I'm getting into me really stretching territory here. I know there's some use of potentially, I think, LiDAR imaging to look at ground patterns to try to potentially determine areas where old growth exists. If anyone knows more about that, please jump in right now, because I don't know a ton about it. But it does suggest that you at least have some of that patterning potentially lasting, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is microtopography. I haven't specifically done work on it. We're trying to, with the old growth working group, work on creating a rubric to help determine old growth condition. And we're trying to put in questions related to tip up mounds and things like that. And it's really hard to go out and say, okay, that's a tip up mound, because what if it's a small hole? It looks really old and you don't know what it is. If it's clearly a tip up mound versus not, it's super hard to quantify those things. And so I have a feeling that might be part of the reason why you don't necessarily see a lot of direct, it's easy to count number of trees or measure how big they are. A tip up mound, that's a lot harder.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So some of these lands may be privately owned, right? So you showed that map about old growth forest where they exist, right, currently. Do you know the ownership where is it more on the private land versus federal state land where those old growth forests exist currently?
I think the vast majority are on either federal or state lands. I mean, there's some on private. There's a great book, Mary Davis. There's a good book that tries to quantify location of old growth forests by state. I think it's mostly Eastern US, but I think the vast majority, when I'm thinking of Adirondacks. There's some up in Minnesota, I think Boundary Waters, Michigan, Porcupine Mountains. But here, most of our old growth is in the Smokies, or up, it's gonna be Nantahala, I think most of it, not all, but most is public land. Is my sense.
Thinking like from like a long-term like management perspective, like we have a lot of mature forests and maybe like we want more old growth forests on the landscape. Is kind of the approach more to like allow the mature forest to kind of secede into old growth, or is there an interest in like kind of actively maybe through like silviculture trying to maybe speed up that process a little, maybe like, you know, increase dead wood or something, you know?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there's some debate about active versus passive management for old growth characteristics, kind of the passive being you let it develop through time on its own. There definitely is work done on managing for old growth characteristics. And if you send me an email, I'm happy to send you more informed, more articulate information on that. But in particular in the Northeast, a little bit less so in the Southeast. I've definitely seen work on saying creating snags or say girdling trees to create large standing deadwood. And it's all that I've seen kind of related to trying to create or more quickly create some of those conditions we talked about earlier, right? Exactly like you're saying, maybe cut down a tree and leave it there. There's some things you can do. It's hard to make a tree grow faster. It's hard to make a tree go bigger, any faster than it's going to already. But there definitely can be attempts to create some of those characteristics. And I think there are attempts to do that. So that's kind of my rough sense. I do think too, because we've got our mature forests all look very similar, probably not, let me rephrase that. Our mature forests look more similar across the landscape than the forests that we probably had in the past. And so there definitely is a drive to increase that landscape variation, and that might be creating some young forest in patches and also putting in some of those old growth characteristics, kind of increasing the patchiness to increase that variation. Does that make sense? But email me. I've got, for one of the presentations from before, I was looking into management. I think it's in its earlier stages of figuring out the best way to directly manage for some of the old growth characteristics. And it's tough too, because if old trees are the thing that we all think of when we think about old growth, you can't really manage that early.
Just wondering if you guys are doing any work on how the structural and compositional differences among old growth and mature forests might influence ecosystem services and functions, and if you are, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are probably some differences, I would guess, in ecosystem services. There's been a little bit of work done on that. I think in particular, ecosystem services in relation to wildlife habitat is the one that I can mainly think of. There's definitely some concern about kind of the interaction between mesification and old growth versus mature forests. So this potential transition to more shade tolerant, drought intolerant species. So essentially, is red maple taking over everywhere? And what does that mean for ecosystem services? The big one being red maple drinks a ton of water. If we've got a bunch of red maple or there's other more mesic tree species versus oak species, does that mean we've got a real problem in terms of water availability? Now, how that necessarily interacts with old growth versus mature is kind of a complex question. But there's definitely some evidence to suggest that, in particular in those areas that did burn in the past, we do see some of these old growth forests. That process is starting, that mesification process, that transition to those more mesic forests may be starting. So this is a nice way of me not answering your question and answering a different thing. But that's the best I can go into with that. I think also part of the struggle is a direct, because old growth is so rare and it's hard to compare them, it's really difficult to ask a larger scale question like that about ecosystem services. If you wanted to, the Smokies would be a great place to do it. But then you'd have to get permission from the Park Service. I'll be here. If anyone would prefer to ask a question just to me, I'll be up here. So thanks. This was really nice to come chat. nice to be in a place with power and water. Maybe not. Yeah.
Like, after some grass, it's not disturbance or oppression. Oh, it's.
Yes.